Okay, guys. To paint an egg tempera, you're going to need three things. First thing you're going to need, of course, is your egg material. The second thing that you're going to need is your anti fermentation agent. We'll get into that. And then the third thing you're going to need is your pigments, right? So, quick note on your anti fermentation agent. You can use vinegar, you can use alcohol for this, just anything that's going to keep stuff from growing in your paint is what you want, because again, the egg material is, it's a very protein rich kind of material and things want to grow in there, so you want to keep that from happening by using some kind of anti-fermentation agent. Now, I was taught to use dry white wine, right? And wine is really nice because it offers a very nice aroma to the medium. If you want to use wine, you don't want to use red wine because you don't want the red coloration of the wine to affect the color of your paint. And you don't want to use a sweet wine because you don't want that sugar to offer a food source, again, for things that might want to grow on your paint, right? So dry white wine is what you want. I use Barefoot Chardonnay just because it's really affordable. It's available pretty much anywhere, and I don't particularly love drinking it. No offense to anybody who likes Barefoot Chardonnay. And now a note on your pigments. You can just buy little jars of pigment at any art supply store. This is just gambling, which is great. And this little jar will last you forever. Now, if you have a little bit more money and you want to be a little bit more historically accurate in your colors, you can buy from Rublev or you can buy from the Limner's Guild. Both make really good, more historically accurate paints. Or if you just want to lose your mind entirely, you can, start oxidizing metal and scraping the rust off and grinding rocks into powder and finding plants and grinding them and doing all that stuff. But for the purposes of what we're doing today, just some store-bought pigment is going to be just fine, right? Now, a couple of other things you might need just to do some painting with, of course, palette is going to be really nice. Tempera is a very liquidy kind of paint, so I like these little concave palettes are really good to keep it from going everywhere. Brushes, of course, you're going to need. Now, I would recommend soft bristled brushes, right? Really stiff brushes like the white nylon and stuff tend to not work very well for tempera because tempera is kind of fragile, I guess, when it's not totally cured. Now, when it's cured, of course, it's bulletproof and it lasts for thousands of years, but when it's not quite cured, it's very fragile. So that's why I recommend a very soft bristled brush for this. And then a couple of other things you might want are some glass jars or bottles or plastic cups or whatever, something to stir with, of course. And then I highly recommend a couple of eyedroppers. Eyedroppers are really nice for this process. So the first thing we need to do is prepare our egg emulsion. Our egg emulsion is a combination of our egg material and our anti-fermentation agent. And the egg emulsion is what we mix with our pigment to actually create paint, right? So the first thing we want to do is create our emulsion. So take your egg and go ahead and crack your egg and separate the yolk from the white. Now, you can use the egg white to make tempera, but there's a whole process to it. You got to strain it and do all this stuff to it, and it's kind of a whole process. So we're just going to skip that today, and we're just going to use the yolk because it's kind of already ready to be used, and you can use the egg whites to make yourself an omelet or something later, right? So what I'm going to do, now that I've got my yolk separated, we want all that wonderful, squishy, sticky yellow goop in there, but we don't necessarily want the membrane around it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up my yolk and I'm going to use whatever I have to poke a little hole in it. Now I have a palette knife here, so that's what we're going to use. And I'm just going to poke a little hole in the membrane, and then I am just going to squeeze out all that wonderful yellow goop, which we do want, leaving the membrane behind, which we don't want. Now, when you're making your first batch of egg emulsion, don't feel like you're going to have to use a half dozen eggs for this. Guys, one egg will do a surprising amount of painting, right? So just start with one egg and see how far it goes before you start trying to crack a half a dozen eggs. Now, again, we don't want to use just the egg by itself to make our paint because then things will want to grow in it and we'll end up with very furry paintings, right? So we're going to mix in a little bit of our anti-fermentation agent. Again, in my case, I'm just using a little bit of Barefoot Chardonnay, nice dry white wine. Now, the mixture here is pretty easy. You want 1 part egg yolk and maybe about 2 parts white wine. So I'm just gonna eyeball it. I'm not gonna measure it. I'm just gonna kind of guess here. I'm just gonna kind of eyeball what I think looks about right. That looks like that might be a little bit wine heavy, but it'll work out just fine. So again, about 1 part egg to about 2 parts wine, and then take your mixing tool and just give it a good stir. Now, guys, this will create a fluid that is a wonderful kind of pastel yellow color. I don't know how you guys can see that. And I think it has a really lovely aroma. It smells like you would expect, kind of like eggs and wine mixed together. I think it's a really lovely aroma, and I think the color of that is really nice as well. Gosh, I'm making a huge mess here. Sorry about that. All we need to make paint now is our emulsion and our pigment, right? So I'm just going to take a little bit of pigment. And guys, again, the ratio here is about 1 to 1. So again, when you're mixing emulsion, it's about 1 part yolk to about 2 parts wine. When you're mixing paint, it's about 1 part emulsion and 1 part pigment, right? So I'm just going to grab a little bit of pigment. Now, again, guys, this egg tempera goes a very long way. So I'm not going to make a whole lot of it. And I would encourage you guys to make just a little bit at a time because you will be surprised how far this paint will go. So now I have my pigment here. I'm going to add some emulsion. Again, about 1 to 1. So this is where my eyedropper comes in handy. I just grabbed a little bit of that emulsion and I'm just going to come over here. And again, I'm just going to kind of eyeball it. So I'm just going to shoot for about equal parts pigment to emulsion. And you can see that this pigment is really nice. It's already kind of starting to soak into that emulsion. Some of these pigments, like malachite, you will find are very hydrophobic and they don't want to mix in without a little bit of coaxing, right? So let's go ahead and just take our brush and just give it a little bit of a stir. There we go. You can see how wonderfully well those are blending together. Looks great. Look how wonderful that color looks. That's perfect. All right, so now that we've mixed up our first bit of paint, let's go ahead and do a little bit of painting. I have a little sketch that I've already kind of done earlier of this little Mernite guy. I always like to keep a little extra paper handy just so I can kind of test my paint before I actually get it on my piece here. Now, I am going to go ahead and mix up a little bit more color. I think I'm going to mix up a little bit of red. I have some Gambling Indian red here. So I'm just going to, again, just like before, I'm just going to grab a little bit with my palette knife and tap out a little bit onto my palette. There we go. And then I'm going to add about 1 part emulsion to 1 part pigment. Just got to eyeball it. Doesn't have to be perfect. And then I'll go ahead and stir those up to create my paint. Now, guys, one of the wonderful things about egg tempera is it is water soluble, right? So you can treat it much like an acrylic or a watercolor. And if you find that you have a color that you like and you try it out, but maybe it's like, I don't know, maybe it's just a little too opaque or whatever, you can always add a little bit of water to it to soften it up. So what I might do is grab a little bit of this Indian red that I've mixed and bring it over here to the palette next to me. And then I have just some fresh water here. I'm just going to take a little dropper with some water, add a few drops, and stir it together. And that will dilute the paint a little bit. And you can just do that until it's how you like it. So you can paint really thick if you like really thick paint, or you can thin this out to whatever watercolor like consistency that you might want it to be, right? So you can see I've just kind of got a couple of degrees of softer, thinner paint here. Perfect. And the great thing about tempera is it layers on top of itself beautifully. So you can always go with a little bit of thinner paint at first and then thicken it up, layer it up as you go. So I kind of like this middle consistency here that I've made. Oh, you know what? I'm not going to use that brush though. I like to use a firmer brush for mixing my paints. So like this is just kind of a white nylon brush, which I don't recommend painting with. But since it's a little bit thicker than the soft brushes that I like to use, it tends to make mixing the paint a little bit easier. All right. So guys, one thing you're going to notice about tempera is it starts to separate immediately. The pigment and the emulsion, they don't mix to be a permanent consistency like you would expect from watercolor paint or an acrylic paint. They tend to separate immediately. So one thing I always recommend is every time you go back to reload your brush with color, just give it a little stir, right? And you'll find that that will kind of reintegrate the emulsion and the pigment together. And I always kind of brush a little bit off because it can be very, very thick, right? And so then I'm just going to come in here and start adding a little bit of color into my little Night guy. There we go. And you can see that the egg tempera paint dries just so quickly. It just dries almost immediately. It's like it's even more quick drying, I think, than acrylic tends to be. It just dries almost immediately unless you have it on there very thick. Now, one of the things people always say about tempera is that you can't work wet on wet. You know, it dries so quickly that you can't blend it wet into wet like you can oil paints, right? And that's kind of true, but there are some great effects that you can get that are like blending or will kind of make you kind of trick the eye into thinking that the colors are nicely blended together like you can do with oil paint. So I'm going to show you one such trick, right? I've got a little bit of green here. I'm kind of starting with a little bit of green out on the end of my Knight's tail. And I'm going to gradiate out this green so that it kind of subtly gradiates out until it disappears. And then I'll come back and I'll blend some blue into kind of the other side of it to create that effect of green blending into blue, right? So what I want to do for this is I want to take a little bit of emulsion and water just as kind of a blending medium. So I'm going to take my water dropper here and I'm going to give myself about, I don't know, 3 drops or 6 drops, usually about 3 drops of emulsion to about 10 drops of water makes a really good kind of blending agent. So I did 6 drops of emulsion. So I'll do, what would be about 20 drops of water. So again, about 3 drops of emulsion, about 10 drops of water will give you a nice kind of blending medium. So I've got my green here. Let me give myself, now you have to move pretty quickly for this to work. Because again, the egg tempera, it dries so quickly that you only have a moment to make this work. So I've brushed a little bit of green down. I'm going to get a little bit of my emulsion and I'm going to brush it right into the end of the color that I just put down out there. And then you can see as I brush it out, it gets a little bit softer. It kind of creates that sense of a little bit of a gradient, and you can just blend it out until it disappears, right? Almost like making like a little value scale of green, right? Now, once that's dry, I'll repeat the process with blue coming back the other way, and that will give me a sense of that color blending, right? All right, now here's one of the really fun parts, guys. Now that we have all of our colors kind of laid in here, we can start adding some highlights and shadows and things like that. So, I showed you that trick where you can kind of get the illusion of blending a little bit of green and blue together by using that just mixing medium. You can do the same thing to get a sense of highlight on all these other areas as well. So, like, I'm going to go back in here into kind of this red tunic area because I still have some of that red paint that I started out with, but I'm going to add a little bit of white to it to kind of lighten it up to give me a lighter valued version of that. Now you don't always have to use white. I could maybe lighten it up with yellow and give it a little bit of a yellow tint or whatever. But I'm just going to keep it kind of straightforward. I just added a little bit of white right in there, and now I'm going to add a little bit of emulsion, again, trying to keep that 1-to-1 ratio as best I can. I'm throwing in about as much emulsion as I think I threw in white. And now I'm just going to stir that into the leftovers from my red that I made earlier. And there we go. You can see I'm getting a nice, ooh, maybe that's a little lighter than I would like. I might add a little bit of extra red in there to just tone that back down a little bit. There we go. I feel pretty good about that. I think that might be a pretty decent highlight color. Now I've got my lighter red here, and I have a little bit of that just emulsion and water right here that I'll use to kind of blend it all together. Now again, I don't like to paint with my mixing brush, so I'm going to put that aside. And now, here we go. I'm going to grab a little bit of that lighter kind of reddish color that I mixed up. And I might come in here and just start brushing a little bit of like a highlight color onto some of that red tunic. There we go. Now I could just do a highlight in this lighter color if I wanted to, but I want to try to get a little bit of that blending effect. So real quick before it has a chance to dry, I'm going to grab a little bit of that emulsion and water mixture, and I'm going to brush a little bit right into the side of it and kind of pull it out, gradiate it out a little bit, hopefully to create that sense of a light. Oh boy, the light's kind of hard in here. There we go. So you get kind of a sense of a little bit of gradient happening there. Boy, I'm going to have to get a better lighting situation in here if I'm going to do many more of these. Now, another thing you can do when you're adding highlights and shadows is just mix up your lighter or darker value versions of your color. Like I have my original green and I've kind of added, again, just a little bit of white to it. And I'm going to give it a good stir. And then you can come in here and let's test it, make sure it looks about like I want. Okay, yeah, it looks pretty good. And then you can come in here and you can start adding like little highlights just in little lines. So again, this is tempera, which was the, kind of dominant painting medium in the Middle Ages. And so, artists had a different value structure back then, and they weren't quite as concerned with, replicating the observable universe. So it lends itself to like a little bit more of a cartoony kind of style, which can really come out, whenever you're adding in these highlights and things like that. So again, the lighting situation in here is not the best ever, but you can get a sense for how, just adding those little lighter highlights in there on the scales are giving me like a nice sense of a highlight in there. All right, guys. Now let's take a look at our final piece, our finished Mernite. Looks pretty good, I think. And you can tell, even though you can't do the wet on wet blending with the tempera like you can with oil, you can still get some really nice blending effects that have a similar look, right? Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I hope that demystified a little bit of the medium of egg tempera for you guys. Now, of course, there's a whole lot more to learn. This is just a beginner, kind of scratching the surface of egg tempera. I hope you guys enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please, consider liking and maybe subscribing. This is actually my first YouTube video I've ever made, and so it would be nice, if I got some likes and stuff. That would let me know that people are interested in this kind of thing and would like to see more of it. So until next time, guys, thank you so much.